I want to welcome and thank Joshua for coming today. Joshua Ortiz Baco is a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. He's one of our grantees from 2020 to now. His project is called Unearthing Brazilian, Cuban, and Puerto Rican Abolitionism in the 19th century US press. And I'm gonna let him take it away. I also want to briefly welcome our other grantees who joined us to support Joshua. So take it away, Joshua.
Hi, thank you for that great introduction. I am visiting from Puerto Rico virtually, which means that I am going to be keeping my camera off while I present, because the internet is going to have a fit. But I will share my screen. Okay, is that showing up for everybody? You should be seeing a map.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. So like Lorena said, my name is Joshua Ortiz Baco. I'm a PhD candidate going into my 6th year in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas. And my project, so I was funded to do part of my project, which is my dissertation project. And that project centers on recreating hemispheric debates about race and emancipation through the digital recreation and contextualization of the transnational networks of the Spanish and Portuguese language press of the US. And so as part of that larger project, I'm interested in how Cuban, Puerto Rican, Brazilian press in the US mobilize practices of newspaper editing, such as reprinting and visual layouts, to reach wider audiences and influence the public sphere in not just the US, but also the Caribbean and Latin America. I argue that these non-English language newspapers, which were so often overlooked, were actually pivotal for the development of racial discourses across the hemisphere, and that their nature as diasporic, as opposed to just national, produced newspapers offers a rare chance to understand the circulation of racial constructs during the 19th century. And simultaneously, I'm also interested in why materials like these papers, which I'm calling diasporic newspapers, have been excluded from the historical record of histories of race, and how their inclusion in the digital cultural record can reframe how we practice digital humanities in a more expansive and inclusive way that is responsive to the ways that diverse voices create and express knowledge. So for today's talk, I am presenting a section of my first chapter, which focuses on a case study of an abolitionist periodical in 19th century New York, which was edited by Cubans and Puerto Ricans and called La América Ilustrada, a famed Cuban newspaper called El Diario de la Marina, and the New York Herald. In this section, I recount a heated event that started in the late 1872s and continued until mid-1873 that involved all three papers in a kind of one of the clearest demonstrations of how information was constantly traveling and being reinterpreted across languages, geographies, and political affiliations. While I don't go into depth in this presentation about the racial discourses that are at play in the back and forth between all three papers, I do want to give kind of a brief context for those that aren't super familiar with the period. And so this event is happening in the 4th year of the 10-year war. This is a conflict between rebel forces in Cuba and the Spanish government. One of the common accusations that were laid at the revolutionary forces, the Cuban revolutionary forces at that time, was that the rebellion was in fact a race war, incited in part by the US and England. For its part, the US was experiencing the tail end of the Reconstruction era. And while abolitionist societies were kind of on the wane at this point, it was still an important part of the discourse in relation to Cuba. The editors of La América Ilustrada had to negotiate both of these contexts, as well as the divisions between the local Cuban diaspora as well as trying to maintain support from other Latin American immigrants and Latino groups. So what you're seeing here is actual clippings from the newspaper. And at this point, there was a war of words between the Herald and El Diario de la Marina. When La América Ilustrada caught wind of this debate, they started translating the first-hand accounts of the Herald, which were in English. And so the debate centered around the fact that the Herald had sent a reporter to Cuba, and that reporter had been forced into a hasty escape from Cuba after El Diario published an incendiary letter from its New York correspondent and a follow-up article that put him at risk of being arrested or executed by Spanish authorities. They further claimed that the Herald's favorable depictions of the insurgency had caused consternation on the island because they ran counter to the official narrative reported in El Diario. The letter from El Diario's correspondent in New York and subsequent articles insisted that the original affront had been committed by the editors of the Herald, whose reporter had traveled to Cuba under false pretenses, which led to his detainment. The two newspapers continued to trade blows months later, with El Diario accusing the New York publication of having lost its standards to the point of printing unas paparruchas inventadas en la agencia laborante y puestas en forma de documentos mambises acabados de llegar de la Manigua. In reporting to their charge of printing false documents and serving as the mouthpiece of the Cuban insurgents, the Herald response alluded to the Spanish government's control of the newspaper by mocking the writer of El Diario and saying, and this is a bit hard to read, not just in the presentation, but in doing research on newspapers. But what it reads is, a correspondent with such wonderful sources of information at his command and so great an acquaintance with the inner life of New York journalism must be of inestimable value to the Diario, which is somewhat dull and somber sheet with that air of officialism. The dispute between the newspapers reveals an interconnectedness and familiarity between the public spheres of Cuba and the US, but it also reveals a contest to control the circulation of news. In essence, the allegations of printing false documents and operating as state media question whether the other newspaper is actually engaged in the flow of information or merely fabricating it. In this way, many other newspapers, telegrams, letters, and official communiques moved up and down the Atlantic, offering and contesting informations. At times, documents came within documents, as in the letter from the New York correspondent printed in El Diario, or telegrams in the Herald, or even the translations of these reports in La América Ilustrada. In other cases, it was left to the reader to decipher the web of references through which the information had traveled until reaching its articulation on the page, who was being addressed, and the extent to which this transnational imagined community stretched. The editors of La América Ilustrada also existed within this same communication circuit, moving between the role of reader and writer and producing meaning through their interpretations in original articles, as well as by reprinting and re-signifying materials from others. In this case, the chronology and contents of the back and forth are explicitly presented on the page, as you can see here from actually citing the Herald. But in other cases, these exchanges are only implied, or they're references that don't quite situate the time or the author or the publication. And so in suggesting a networked reading of La América Ilustrada, my intention is to point out the interlocutors that shaped the discourse in the newspaper and that are scarcely represented beyond the citations and reprints included in the text. And so in order to understand the discourse in La América Ilustrada, I argued that it is essential to reintroduce the external and internal flows of information of the articles it published in both the material circulation, that is where and when it was expected to be read, as well as the other potential newspapers and narratives that co-created the discursive formation. And so my interest And this particular example shows that as the Herald's report came in, so did the idea, firsthand account, that the majority of the forces in Cuba were Black soldiers, shirtless and barefoot. But to the dismay of the political power on the island, represented by El Diario, they were also motivated and well-organized. In their translation of the reports, the editors of La América Ilustrada deracialized the soldiers, focusing instead on the poor conditions of their camp and weapons as part of a long-standing plea by the paper for monetary and equipment support from the US and other nations. These are threads and tensions that emerge as the interpellation to audiences and contexts are reconnected into conversations. So in order to approach these issues, I collected the date, title, and topics of every article of the first 2 years of publication that included a reference, reprint, mention, or translation of another newspaper, as well as the titles and editors of these newspapers. The editors of La América Ilustrada often express the ideological and physical geographies of the newspaper as central to its editorial program, which led me to also collect the city and country in which the newspapers were published. In the same way, I included the language, which you see here, in which the article could be found in La América Ilustrada and in the original publication, so as to engage with the newspaper's representation of language as a constitutive part of a cultural rather than just a geographical community. And so the resulting networks there we go. The resulting networks show the newspaper's expanding circulation as stemming from a mix of Latin American, Latino, and North American sources, even as it continued to proclaim itself as the translator of, and I quote, los principios políticos y sociales que han llevado a los Estados Unidos a su actual esplendor. The small data set constructed from a Spanish language publication offers a different possibility to the arguments made through large-scale cultural analytics projects focused on periodicals which rely predominantly on white English language newspapers. Namely, I find that in the case of La América Ilustrada, diasporic Spanish language newspapers could contingently leverage English language titles with larger circulations in the US to provide validation for particular political projects. The Herald, for example, becomes a stand-in for a US press system in a number of La América Ilustrada's articles. My interest in recreating and interrogating the use of these networks lies in demonstrating the role of circulation in diasporic newspapers and what the use of these technologies meant for the central debates associated with nation building and racial identity in the Caribbean and Latin America. While the contradictions between the articles related to Cuba that discuss abolitionism and those that primarily rely on a deracialized discourse may be evident at the text level as you're reading the newspaper, recreating the network created and projected by La América Ilustrada is an attempt to destabilize this harmonious narrative suggested by the glossy pages and the careful layout of the content. In other words, the presence of other newspapers within its pages reveals how constructed the page can be. And in turn, that mirrors the way in which abolitionist discourse, sovereignty, and internationalization of the Cuban national identity are themselves rhetorical constructions predicated on circulation. My goal is that this recreation of mobility and circulation as a guiding principle of visualizations presents these materials and debates anew. So to wrap up, this project would have not been possible without the guidance, support, and patience from Drs. Carolina Villarroel, Lorena Gathoro, and Gabriela Baeza. It's been an immense pleasure and a huge growing opportunity to be in this grant, to be a part of this cohort. And as all of you are coming in, please do reach out, feel free to connect. You have all of my social media information at the bottom there, but I will ask Lorena to share that out including my email. I would love to stay in touch and would love to see the projects that are about to take shape. With that, I'll stop sharing.
And let's open this up for questions. Oh, thank you so much, Joshua. That the chat. Yeah.
Awesome.
And how empowering and how much this, tells us about the Latino record, right, Gabby?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it just makes me a little emotional because we started this project, fighting, opening up spaces and elbowing people so that we could, give us an opportunity to fund more Latinos, more young scholars who are the future, right, of the work that has been happening at the recovery program and the work that we continue to do. And this project especially is empowering for me because it is part of a dissertation. It is extending a lot of this work, so it's attacking all kinds of fields for us. So thank you, Joshua, for being part of our first cohort, doing an amazing work, and I'm a fan.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. Amazing. Yes, this is wonderful. I do nothing about Mapbox until this very moment, and I'm all excited. I had a question about how this has influenced your dissertation, how this has influenced the work you did on this project. If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that.
Sure. So originally, the work that I was doing with the visualizations were mainly about presenting the research, simply communicating, what I had done. And having this grant gave me a little bit extra time to actually sit down and read about the fact that creating these visualizations already has a meaning and a history behind it, that creating these sort of digital representations isn't the equivalent of putting something up on the internet and that's it, and it's flat and it doesn't convey anything. The process itself became part of my dissertation, so describing what I had to learn, what I had to do, how I understood what these visualizations were, and the sort of transformation of my reading, the data that I was able to pull and create into a visualization. That in itself was this kind of intellectual work that I sort of took for granted. I kind of assumed, well, people learn how to use PowerPoint and nobody talks about that. So this is kind of the same thing. And it now I'm convinced that it's not, and it's actually, it became part of my methodology. So it's not just reading the newspapers and creating these graphs, it's also going back to the graphs to read the newspapers and sort of focusing on in and out and doing this micro and macro reading. But overall, with the grant just gave me the time and space to actually think of these things, because everything is, with the dissertation, it's go, go, go. And pairing that as well with the other work that I have to do, you sort of throw things together and hope that they stick. And the grant gave me a little bit of space during, honestly, during the pandemic, the first couple of months during the pandemic where I couldn't work. And it let me sit down and think about these things. And that's where the first chapter came about. And now the rest of the chapters have taken a turn, because what I learned here is it changed the project. It changed what I was doing. So now I have to sit down and rewrite, but for the better, it's more work, but it's a kind of work that is really exciting and that I've found really compelling.
Any other questions? I want to see if, could you tell, because so many of the people in this group are just starting, are there any things that like tips or like what you wish you had known before, or things you wish you had done, especially with like collecting data or approaching like DH, and aspects that you had not tried before?
I think what I wish I would have done, but I know it's a big ask in most of the cases, was to think about what I wanted the end product to look like the shoot for the moon kind of thing, so that then I could go into the meetings that I had with Gabby and with you, Lorena, and with Carolina, and be like, I have no idea how to get from where I am to there. But this is where I would like to get to. And then, you know, wherever I land in the middle of that is great, you know. But I was always trying to learn as much as I could before I got to the meetings, instead of trusting the process of like, let's just talk. Because you all have much more expertise in these areas, and you also know more people. So the other part, and this might seem a little silly, but it's not, is following Lorena on Twitter. Because Lorena is constantly talking to a ton of really smart, really interesting people that have been kind and generous with their time as well. So being active on social media, being networking would be the more professional way of calling that. But yes, networking, talking to people, joining Twitter is a big deal. And being active and not being afraid to start conversation and asking for help.
Yeah, I mean, when we don't know how to do something, Twitter has been so useful to be like, hey, I don't know how to do this. And then like whenever anybody doesn't know how to do that and they don't have like a big Twitter following, I am happy to retweet. All of us are happy to retweet. And you'll notice that the Latino and the DH community on Twitter is very giving, and they're really happy to share code, to share projects, to share links and articles and tutorials that are really, really helpful. So like we mentioned earlier before you were here, Joshua, that Googling and looking stuff up on YouTube is really helpful. It's the same thing with like social media and reaching out and developing that network.
Completely.
And I see Caroline has that question. Oh, both. David wants to know if you could share your contact info and link to materials in the chat. And yeah, I could do that at some point. And then Caroline asks, how did you approach your decision making of what or what not to include and how?
In terms of, so because this is part of my dissertation, other people have made decisions for me. Originally, this was a humongous project with a lot of other newspapers. And when I applied to the grant and aid, part of the project was going to a few other archives in the US to find these materials. Because the piece that I was able to write about is tiny. The world of Spanish language press in the US and the history is beyond what we would imagine. I think some of the projects that Arte Público Press and Recovery have been putting out give a glimpse, and there's so much more. But yeah, originally it was this huge thing that would have probably taken me 5 years to do. And I had to make that a lot smaller when the pandemic hit and traveling to archives was no longer an option. And then I had to make it smaller again to fit within the time frame of the grant, right? Because you want to do so much, but you also want to do something at the end where you can say, well, here is a finished product. Here is a thing that I can share with people that is a good representation of my work, even if it's not all of the work that I wanted to do. And so in making that decision, what I did is I kept working on collecting data for the first half of the grant, which takes a humongous amount of time. And I messed it up a couple of times, and I asked for help a ton of times. And then I realized when I got to the 6-month mark, it was like, okay, well, I have 2 years worth of data. I could do more. There are more things out there, but now I need to sit down and clean the data, decide what I'm going to be using in order to visualize or look at this or do something with this. And I don't want to be rushing at the end. And this isn't the only thing that you all are going to be doing or I was doing. So it was a decision of saying, well, you know, what do I actually have time for that's going to make it into a final product? And so I realized 2 years, that's as much as I could fit in there. That's a little over 700 records and a bit more than 1,500 newspaper pages with 4 columns. So it is a ton of text. But then doing the kind of visualization work was just as hard. And so what I decided is, you know, if the visualizations are going to be an important part of this and I'm going to argue for them, I have to give them the same amount of time as creating the data set. So that's what ended up being the decision-making process. In terms of why I picked those newspapers and all of that, I would be more than happy to talk about that later. That was a 4-year trip to get there. But for the grant, it's thinking about what would be a good example of the kind of work that you're doing, even if it's a piece of it.
Thank you.
So we'll do one last question and let you go. Let's see, did you experiment with other software options, or do you have any tips on like trying to figure out what software works best for your data and your project?
Yeah, so the sort of visualization and the hosting is set up on top of Jekyll, which is a static site generator, which is relatively simple to use. And has gotten a lot of documentation and tutorial recently for folks doing DH, and it's easy to get into. The other part is Tableau, which I do not love, but it was something that I was familiar with using. And what I figured out is you first have to get something up, so you have an idea of what the possibilities are. And since I knew Tableau, I knew how to put things in and how to make them look the way that I wanted to, I started with that. And then I started branching out to other things that were a little bit more complicated. And so you're trying to sort of find the thing that you're most comfortable with and then experiment from there. Because if you get caught up trying to use something incredibly complicated like Gephi and then get frustrated and don't really move forward, at the end of the day, the tool is not the important part. The content, your analysis, what you want to say, who you want to talk to, that's what really counts. So, but there is also this process of like, you want to learn how to do stuff. And that's totally valid and totally part of at least my process. But first, find something that you know that works. Get it up, take a look at it, and then go and play, go and experiment without the pressure of saying, well, I don't have anything that works and I don't know how to do anything. That would be my big suggestion. And the other is learn the basics of metadata and metadata cleanup. Like 95% of DH projects that are super amazing are like 95% of it is metadata work.
That was perfect because we just talked about metadata today.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you on behalf of everybody for this wonderful presentation. It's so great to see all the progress that you've done. It's just amazing to see the product and hear your contextualization about it. It's very inspiring. So I want everybody to thank Joshua for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you want, you can just email me and I will send
Hey, USLDH presente.